He didn't speak for months. Not from weakness, from a wound the doctors couldn't see. The most feared general of the American Civil War lay in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, and no nurse dared stay near him for more than 2 minutes. Except her. She arrived every morning, changed his dressing, and spoke to him, even without response. Even when he didn't move a muscle, even when everyone else gave up. And then on the 44th day, he said her name. Not nurse, not miss, her name Margaret, in a hoarse voice as if testing whether the world still existed. What happened next, none of the other nurses expected it. No general in Washington expected it, and she honestly didn't either. The other nurses drew lots for his ward. This was not something they admitted openly. It was a system that had developed over the 3 weeks since General Samuel Voss had arrived at the converted church outside Culpeper, quietly, the way necessary accommodations to difficult circumstances always developed in field hospitals, through the accumulated small negotiations of women who had too much work and too little authority, and had learned to distribute both with the efficiency that survival required. He was not violent. That was what they told the new arrivals. And it was true, and it was also somehow not reassuring. He did not shout. He did not throw things. He did not issue commands or make demands or behave in any of the ways that difficult patients, difficult men typically made themselves difficult. He simply lay in the cot at the end of the ward with the particular quality of stillness that was not sleep and not peace and not acceptance, but something colder than any of those things. And he looked at the ceiling, and he did not speak. He had not spoken in 41 days. The wound that had brought him here was real and had been severe, a rifle ball through the left shoulder, close enough to the lung that the first surgeon had written "unlikely" in his notes, and meant it. He had survived this with the same absolute lack of comment he brought to everything. The shoulder had healed with the slow stubbornness of a body that had decided, independently of its owner, to continue. The owner himself appeared to have no opinion on the matter. What the nurses feared was not the silence exactly, it was the eyes. General Samuel Voss was 41 years old and had commanded the Army of the Potomac Second Corps through 3 years of the kind of war that turned men into something their families would not immediately recognize, and whatever he had seen in those 3 years was still happening somewhere behind his eyes, still present, still loud in whatever interior space he occupied alone. He looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man listening to something no one else could hear, and the nurses, young women, most of them, some barely 20, none of them trained for this particular variety of broken, found that expression more frightening than anger would have been. Anger they understood, this they did not. Margaret Alcott was 26 years old and had been a field nurse for 14 months, which in the arithmetic of the war made her, if not experienced, then at least no longer surprised. She had come from a family of modest means in western Pennsylvania, had trained under a doctor who believed women were capable of more than changing linens, and had arrived at the Culpeper Hospital in July with the practical understanding that fear in a ward was a thing that spread like infection, from nurse to patient and back again, and that the best tool against it was simply to keep moving and keep talking. She drew the short lot on a Wednesday. She took her supplies and walked to the end of the ward without slowing her pace, and set them on the table beside General Voss's cot, and said, in the same tone she used with everyone, "Good morning, General. Your dressing needs changing. This will take approximately 10 minutes and it's going to pull when I remove the bandage, so I'll give you fair warning before I do." He looked at the ceiling. "I'll take that as permission," she said, and began. She talked while she worked. This was what she did, not because she expected responses, she had long since learned not to require them, but because silence in a ward had weight, and weight compounded, and the most effective tool she had found against the weight of silence was the simple human sound of a voice. She talked about practical things, the dressing, the state of the wound which was healing well, the weather outside which had turned cold overnight, the supply wagon that had arrived that morning with actual coffee for the first time in 3 weeks. He did not respond. She did not require him to. She finished the dressing and began gathering her supplies, and almost without deciding to, she started to hum. Not a song exactly, the beginning of one, a hymn she had learned as a child, low and unhurried. She hummed it the way she did most things, without performance, because it was simply what her hands did when they were occupied with something careful. She hummed it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she stopped, because her hands were done and she was moving to the next cot. In the silence that followed, General Samuel Voss turned his head. Not toward her, not toward anything specific, simply away from the ceiling, a fraction, as if something in the room had shifted and his body had registered it before his mind had decided to. She did not remark on this. She moved to the next cot. But she noted it the way she noted everything she intended to return to, with her full attention briefly, before setting it aside. She came back the next morning. She learned over the following weeks that General Samuel Voss was not absent. This was the thing that the other nurses had misread, she thought. Not that his stillness was nothing, but that it was not nothing. He was in there, he was paying attention. He heard everything that was said in his ward, and processed it with the same precise attention he had presumably once applied to tactical maps. And his silence was not the silence of a man who had left the room, but of a man who had decided, for reasons she could not yet determine, not to return to it, turn. She talked to him every morning during the dressing change. She talked about small things, the progress of other patients whose names she used carefully, the logistics of the hospital's supply situation, the letters she had received from her sister in Pennsylvania, who was raising 3 children and a husband, and managed both with the same capable energy Margaret had always admired. She did not talk about the war. She had learned early that the war was not a useful subject in this ward. It was present enough without naming it. She hummed, every morning, every dressing, the same hymn, low and steady, the sound of a woman who was not performing comfort, but was simply being her own ordinary self in the vicinity of someone who needed ordinariness more than most things. He turned his head on the 4th morning, toward her this time. Not to look at her exactly. His gaze settled in the middle distance, the ceiling's edge, the wall's junction, but the direction was different, toward rather than away. She continued humming. She finished the dressing. She said before she moved to the next cot, "Your shoulder is healing well, General. Another 2 weeks and you'll be able to move it without damage. I'll tell you honestly when that time comes." She moved on. In the afternoon, she stopped humming to speak to a patient 3 cots down. And in the pause, she heard it. Not a sound. Not quite, but a quality of attention that was different from the ward's ordinary attention. The particular alertness of someone who has noticed an absence. She filed this. On the 6th morning, she stopped humming midway through the dressing. Stopped deliberately. A small test of a hypothesis she had been developing. And in the silence that followed, General Samuel Voss's hands, which had been lying flat at his sides, in the specific stillness of a man who had stopped using his body for anything, closed into fists. Not in anger, not in pain. In the reflexive response of someone who had reached for something and found it missing. She resumed humming immediately. His hands relaxed. She looked at the middle distance above his cot and kept her voice even and her hands steady and thought, "There you are." She did not tell the other nurses. This was not cruelty. It was the recognition that what she had found was fragile, and fragile things did not benefit from the attention of people who were afraid of them. She simply continued. Morning dressings, practical conversation, the low, steady hum of the hymn she had learned at 7 years old in a Pennsylvania church, offered to the air of the ward without demand or expectation. On the 19th morning, he watched her. Not the ceiling, not the wall, her. Directly with the grey eyes that she had heard described as frightening and found, now that they were turned on her, simply exhausted. Not cold, not frightening. The eyes of a man who had been very far away for a long time and was, with considerable effort, making his way back towards something and was not yet certain what he was coming back to. She met his gaze without adjusting her expression. She continued humming. She finished the dressing. "The shoulder is almost entirely healed," she said as she gathered her supplies. "You'll have full mobility within the week, the surgeon says. That's genuine news, not the encouraging kind I give patients who won't recover well." She paused. "I try not to lie to people, General. I find it's more respectful not to." She moved on. But she carried the grey eyes with her through the rest of the morning, and she thought about exhaustion and the particular courage of a man who was making his way back from somewhere she could not follow. And she was careful, the next morning, not to miss a single measure of the hymn. The winter settled over Culpeper. The ward shifted. Patients came and recovered and were reassigned or died, the slow, terrible rhythm of the hospital's population. General Voss remained. His wound had healed. The surgeon said there was no medical reason to keep him, and then said nothing further because even surgeons who had grown hardened to most things understood that the wound that kept Samuel Voss in that cot was not in his shoulder. Margaret talked, she hummed, she noticed. On the 43rd morning, she was midway through the dressing, humming the hymn's second verse when he spoke. One word. Her name. Not Nurse Alcott. She had introduced herself as Margaret on the first morning, out of the same practical instinct that told her names mattered, that names returned people to themselves when they were in danger of losing the thread. She had used his name in return every morning, had said, "Good morning, General Vossi," with the same steady casualness she brought to everything. He said, "Margaret." Not loudly, not with any particular inflection, not relief, not urgency, not the performed emotion of a man announcing his own return. Simply her name, in a voice rough from 43 days of disuse, as if trying the shape of a word to confirm the world was still the same shape it had been. She did not stop what she was doing. She finished tying off the bandage with the same careful attention she always gave it, and she said, without looking up, "Your dressing is done, General. The shoulder looks well this morning." A pause. "Margaret," he said again, and this time there was something in it, not quite a question, not quite a statement, the shape of a man making certain that the sound worked, that the tether held. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the grey, exhausted eyes, and there was something new in them that had not been there on any of the previous 43 mornings. Not clarity exactly, the beginning of it, the first pale light of a thing that had been dark for a very long time. "Yes," she said, simply that. "Yes, a confirmation. I am here, you are here, the word worked, the tether holds." She picked up her supplies. "I'll be back tomorrow morning," she said. "Same time. Your dressing won't need changing, but I'll come regardless." She paused. "The coffee this morning is genuinely good. I'll bring you a cup." She moved on to the next cot. Behind her, in the cot at the end of the ward, General Samuel Voss lay with his eyes open and his hands flat at his sides and said nothing further. But the ceiling, she noticed when she glanced back from 3 cots down, held considerably less of his attention than it had the morning before. She hummed the hymn's final verse as she worked and did not look back again. She came back the next morning. She always came back. He came back slowly, the way rivers recede after a flood, not all at once, not cleanly, with debris still visible at the margins, and the land underneath changed from what it had been. Margaret watched it the way she watched all recoveries, with attention, without urgency, the patience of a woman who understood that the body and the mind kept their own timetables and could not be hurried past the point they were ready to move. He spoke in the mornings at first, brief things, single words, then phrases, then occasionally full sentences that arrived with the considered weight of a man who had not spoken in so long that each word felt chosen rather than automatic. "The coffee is good. The shoulder doesn't pull today. You sang a different hymn yesterday." This last one offered as a statement almost, but with the quality of a question underneath. She had not realized he knew it was different. She had changed hymns on a Wednesday in November, almost without deciding to, because the second verse of the first hymn had been stuck in her mind since morning, and she had simply begun it instead. "I grew up with both of them," she said. "They take turns depending on the day." He considered this. What determines which day? She thought about it genuinely, the way she thought about questions he asked. He did not ask things casually, and casual answers would have been a discourtesy. "I'm not certain," she said finally. "The morning, perhaps. The quality of the light." He was quiet for a moment. "That seems reasonable," he said. He asked her one morning in December about Pennsylvania, not in the social way, not the performed interest of a man making conversation, but with the focused attention she had come to recognize as simply how he received information about things that mattered to him. She told him about the town, the family, her father who had been a schoolteacher, and believed that his daughters deserved the same education as his sons, which had been, in the 1850s, not an uncontroversial position. He was right, Voss said. He was, she agreed. He also believed that the ability to be useful was the most honest form of dignity, that a person who could do necessary work well had something that money and status couldn't provide or remove. She paused. "I have found this true in practice." Voss looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, "So have I." Something in his voice that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it, with the particular dryness of a man who had found in an unexpected location a belief he already held. "Though the application has been somewhat different." She allowed herself a small smile at the window, her back to him, checking the quality of a bandage in the light. "Different application. Same principle." Yes, he said, same principle. She did not examine what was happening between them with too much directness. She was by nature and by training a woman who kept her attention on the work in front of her and trusted that honesty, applied consistently, would produce honest results. She talked to him because talking was useful, and he needed to hear that the world was still the world. She hummed because her hands needed the company of sound when they were doing careful things. She answered his questions because they deserved real answers. But she also noticed, she had always noticed. She noticed that he tracked the sound of her voice across the ward before she reached his cot, the particular quality of attention that preceded her arrival. She noticed that his hands, which had lain flat and still for 43 days, were no longer still. They rested differently now with the ease of hands that had remembered their purpose. She noticed that when she stopped humming to speak to another patient, he waited with the specific contained patience of a man who had learned to wait for things and resumed his own occupation only when the sound returned. She noticed in January that he read again. He had asked for books, anything, he had said, with the directness that was the form his character took. I don't require particular subjects. And she had brought him what the hospital had, which was not much. 2 volumes of Dickens, a history of the Greek campaigns, a novel of no particular merit, whose author she had already forgotten. He read them with the same concentrated focus he brought to everything, and occasionally he looked up when she passed and said something about what he had read, not as a performance of recovery, but as the genuine reflex of a person who had encountered something worth sharing. She responded. She had read Dickens. She had opinions about Dickens, which she offered without apology, which made him look at her with the grey eyes in the particular way she had come to think of as his listening face, not the ceiling stare of the first 43 days, but present, engaged, the face of a man who was in the room. He was in the room. He was coming back to it daily, with the same stubbornness his body had shown in healing the shoulder wound. She watched it and was careful not to make it into more than it was, and careful also not to make it into less. The war ended in April. The hospital began to empty with the particular energy of a place that had defined itself by a purpose now suspended, the relief enormous and strange, like a sound that has been so constant you only notice it when it stops. Men were discharged, staff was reassigned. The field hospital at Culpeper was given 30 days to close. General Samuel Voss was discharged in the first week of May. He walked out of the ward on his own feet, with his left shoulder moving freely, and his voice returned to the quality of a man who had remembered how to use it, and his eyes, the grey eyes she had watched change from the ceiling stare to something present, clear and direct in the bright May morning. He stopped at the ward door. He turned back. Margaret was stripping the cot at the end of the ward. His cot, the one she was already thinking of as formerly his, returning it to its neutral function. She looked up when she heard him stop. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at her across the length of the ward with the expression she had last seen on the morning he had said her name for the first time, the person making certain the tether held. "Nurse Alcott," he said. Formal because there were other people in the ward, and he was a man who understood the architecture of what was appropriate in public. "General Voss," she said, the same formality, the same understanding underneath it. "Thank you," he said. Not for the shoulder, not for the dressings. She understood from the quality of the 2 words exactly what he was thanking her for. She looked at him steadily. "Come back from it entirely," she said. "That would be thanks enough." Something moved in his face, the not quite smile which she had learned to read as the fullest expression of warmth he currently had access to. He inclined his head, once, precisely, and put on his hat. He walked out. She finished stripping the cot. She folded the linen with the same careful attention she gave everything, and she stood for a moment with her hands on the folded stack and let herself feel, briefly and without drama, the particular quality of an ending that was not entirely an ending. Then she moved on. There was more work, there was always more work. She hummed the hymn as she went. She told herself that was the end of it. She had told herself that before about things that were not the end. Washington, D.C. in the winter of 1866 was a city in the particular condition of a place that has survived something enormous and is not yet certain what to do with the survival. The war's end had not resolved the country so much as suspended it, the wound present still, the question of healing genuinely open, the social and political machinery turning with the frantic energy of people who understood that what they did now would determine the shape of everything that came after. Margaret had come to Washington in September, following the work the way she always followed work, practically without drama, with the understanding that necessary labor went where it was needed, and she was a person who did necessary labor well. The Freedmen's Bureau Hospital on E Street needed experienced nurses. She was experienced. The arithmetic was simple. She lived in a boarding house on the corner of 9th and F Streets and worked 12-hour days and spent her evenings reading or writing letters to her sister, and did not, in the ordinary run of her life, attend events at the houses of Washington's better families. The Halford winter reception was an exception produced by Mrs. Halford herself, who had encountered Margaret through the hospital's charitable committee and had decided, with the cheerful authority of a woman accustomed to making social decisions for other people, that Margaret ought to come. "You will find it interesting," Mrs. Halford had said. "There are a great many people present who have ideas about how the country should be rebuilt, and a great many of them are wrong, and I find you the kind of person who tells people they are wrong in a way they can actually hear." This was, Margaret thought, possibly the most accurate description of her anyone had offered in some years. She had said yes. The Halford House on Lafayette Square received 200 guests on the evening of the 15th of January, and Margaret arrived in her good dark dress. She had one, reserved for occasions when being underdressed would constitute a discourtesy to her host, and found herself in the particular social position she had learned to occupy with the same competence she brought to everything: present, observant. Comfortable in her own mind, if not entirely in the room. She did not see him immediately. She heard from across the room a particular quality of silence. Not the silence of absence, the silence of presence, the specific gravity of a man around whom a room organized itself without being asked. She had experienced this quality before, in a different room, in a different year, and her body recognized it before her mind had finished the identification. She turned. General Samuel Voss was standing near the east windows. He was in dress uniform, the dark blue with its gold braid and the weight of his rank visible in every line of him. And he was 43 years old, and the grey eyes that had stared at a ceiling for 43 days were clear and direct, and currently moving across the room with the tactical attention of a man who was always in any room assessing the situation. They found her. Something happened in his face. Not dramatically, he was not a man who did things dramatically, but she saw it because she had spent 4 months learning to read the changes in his face that other people missed. A stillness, and then a release of stillness, and then the beginning of movement toward her that stopped itself before it became visible to anyone who was not already watching for it. She walked toward him. It seemed the practical thing to do. They met near the center of the room, equidistant from everything, which felt she thought exactly right. "General Voss," she said. "Miss Alcott," he said. "Not nurse." She was not here as a nurse, and he understood the distinction. His voice was fully recovered, she noted. The roughness was gone, the range restored. It was a good voice. She had always thought it was a good voice, even in its first tentative returns. "You look well," she said. "I am," he said. And then, with the directness she remembered, "You're in Washington." "September," she said. "The Freedmen's Bureau Hospital." Something in his face. "I know the hospital," he said. "I've been present at 3 of their funding hearings this fall." A pause. "I didn't know you were there." "I didn't know you were here," she said. They looked at each other. 2 years of distance, a war ended. The world rearranged, and between them the particular recognition of people who had built something in an extraordinary place and were now standing in an ordinary one, testing whether what they had built transferred. It did. She felt it immediately. The same quality of conversation, the same absence of performance on both sides, the same willingness to say the real thing rather than the social thing. "I have thought about what you said," he said. "When I left, come back from it entirely." She waited. "I have been working on it," he said. "It has taken longer than the shoulder." "That's usually how it goes," she said. "The visible wounds are the simpler ones." "Yes." He looked at her with the grey eyes. When I left, I wanted to say more than I said. I found I didn't have the language yet." He paused. "I have been constructing it since." She looked at him. "What have you constructed?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, the silence of a man choosing words with the same precision he chose everything, a precision she had watched him recover over 4 months of Pennsylvania mornings and Dickens and the quality of light. "That I would like to continue the conversation," he said. the one we were having, that it is the conversation I have found most worth continuing. A pause. And that I was remiss in leaving without saying so. Around them, Washington's social establishment moved through its receptions and its politics, and its careful management of the aftermath of catastrophe, entirely indifferent to two people standing near the center of a room, conducting, in quiet voices, a conversation that had begun in a different year and a different world, and had not, it turned out, ended when the ward door closed. "You were not remiss," she said. "You were not ready." "No," he agreed, "I wasn't." He looked at her steadily. "I am now." She heard this. She received it the way she received things he said, with her full attention, without deflection, giving it the honest consideration it deserved. "I work 12-hour days," she said. "I live in a boarding house on 9th Street. My social availability is limited and my circumstances are not what a man of your position typically—" "Miss Alcott," he said. She stopped. "I spent 43 days looking at a ceiling," he said, "and then a woman brought me coffee and told me my dressing looked well, and hummed a hymn I had not heard since before the war, and I found I was not willing to stop hearing it." His voice was entirely level, the voice of a man who had come back from a long way and had decided, having come back, what was worth saying. "The considerations you are listing are not considerations I find relevant." She looked at him for a long moment. "You remember the number," she said, 43 days. "I remember everything," he said, "from the first morning. You said the dressing would pull when you removed the bandage, and you would give me fair warning first." Something moved in his face, the not-quite smile fuller now than it had been in the hospital, the warmth more accessible than it had been then. "You gave me fair warning about everything. I find it, the most honest form of respect I have encountered." She stood in the center of the Halford reception and felt the thing she had been not examining for 14 months insist, with the patience of things that have waited long enough, on being examined. "There is a coffee house on Pennsylvania Avenue," she said. "I go on Sunday mornings when the hospital gives me the morning. The coffee is good." He looked at her. "Sunday," he said. 8 o'clock, she said, "if you're willing to be early." "I have been waking at 5 since 1862, he said. 8 o'clock is not early." She allowed herself the full smile this time, not the restrained version she gave public rooms. He saw it, and the not-quite smile became something more complete, and she thought that she had been right on that first morning in the ward to note that he was worth returning to. "Sunday, then," she said. "Sunday," he said. Around them, the reception continued its careful social business. Mrs. Halford, catching Margaret's eye from across the room, raised one eyebrow with the expression of a woman who had anticipated this outcome and was prepared to accept the credit. Margaret looked away before she could respond to it. She found, walking home through the January cold, that she was humming. The first hymn, the one she had begun on that first morning without deciding to. She had not hummed it, she realized, since she had left the hospital. She had not noticed the absence until the sound returned. She hummed it the rest of the way home. The trouble came in April, the way trouble in Washington usually came, sideways, wearing the face of concern. 3 months of Sunday mornings had built the kind of conversation that could not be easily categorized, which made it, in Washington's social taxonomy, a problem. They talked about the Reconstruction legislation and the Bureau's funding and the specific operational failures of the Army's demobilization policy that Voss was quietly working to correct through channels Margaret was learning, slowly, to understand. They talked about Pennsylvania and about Dickens and about the particular difficulty of returning to a world that had changed while you were occupied with surviving. They talked occasionally about the hospital, not the war itself. They had an unspoken agreement about the war itself, but the specific texture of those months, the details she had not known he was registering and had been registering with the same comprehensive attention he gave everything. He told her one Sunday in February that he had counted the mornings she hummed the first hymn versus the second one. 31 first hymn, 12 second hymn, 4 occasions where you switched mid-dressing, he said. The second hymn correlated with mornings where there had been a death in the ward the previous night. She had stared at him. "You counted." "I had nothing else to do," he said, with the dry precision that was his version of humor, "for the first several weeks." She had looked at her coffee cup for a moment. "The second hymn is what my mother sang when she was sad," she said. "I must carry it the same way." He was quiet. Then, "I'm sorry about the mornings that required it." "So am I," she said, "but less sorry than I would have been if I hadn't been there." He looked at her across the coffee cups with the grey eyes that were no longer exhausted. Still serious, always serious, but present and clear and carrying, she had come to understand, considerably more warmth than their surface temperature suggested. "Less sorry," he said. "Yes, that is exactly the right formulation." Washington noticed them, because Washington noticed everything. The general who had gone silent and the nurse who had brought him back. It was a story the city told with the mixture of romance and speculation that political capitals applied to anything they could not entirely categorize. Most of the attention was benign, some of it was not. Colonel Reginald Marsh was the not benign variety. Marsh was 52 and had served under Voss for 3 years and had developed in that time the particular grievance of a man who believed he should have been promoted further and had found a reason for his stagnation that had nothing to do with his own considerable failings. He had decided in the fall of 1865 that Voss's survival and recovery were somehow inconvenient, that a general returned from silence was a general whose authority was restored, and that this restoration had costs for men who had grown comfortable in the interim. He had been constructing a story. Margaret had not known this until the Hadley Spring Gala, when the story arrived in the room fully formed. It arrived via a woman she did not know, in a group of 4 near the fireplace in the Hadley East Parlour. Margaret had come with Mrs. Halford, who had insisted, and had been occupying the edges of the room with the practiced invisibility of a woman who understood her position in spaces like this one. Voss was present somewhere. She had seen him near the entrance on arrival, deep in conversation with 2 senators. The woman's voice was not quiet enough. "The nurse who managed his treatment," she was saying with the careful warmth of a person delivering news they have decided is important. "Apparently she was, well, you understand how it is in those hospitals. The propriety of it was always..." A pause. "And now she follows him here to Washington. One can hardly blame her given her circumstances, but one does wonder what she understood her role to be." Margaret stood near the fireplace and absorbed the words with the same stillness she had once maintained in difficult wards. She understood what was happening. The shape of it was familiar. She had watched it done to other women, in other rooms, and had never quite believed it would be done to her, which was perhaps the particular vanity of a woman who had always trusted her own competence to speak for itself. The woman's companion said something she did not catch. The first woman laughed softly. "Well, Voss always did have unusual appetites. They say he didn't speak for months." One wonders what kind of management that required. The implication was explicit enough to be unmistakable and vague enough to be undeniable. Margaret felt the cold of it settle in her chest. Not shock, she was past shock, but the specific clarity of a woman who understands she is watching her reputation being disassembled in public and calculating what she has available to stop it. She was calculating when the room changed. She felt it before she heard it. The same quality of gravity she had identified at the Halford reception. The specific atmospheric shift of a room adjusting itself to a presence it could not ignore. She turned, as she had turned then, toward the east archway. General Samuel Voss was crossing the room. He was not hurrying. He never hurried. He moved with the measured, unhurried purpose that was simply how he moved through the world, and the room parted for him with the instinctive deference of people who understood, without being told, that this was a man who did not stop when he had decided to move. He stopped in front of the group of 4 women. He looked at the woman who had been speaking with the grey eyes at full clarity, and she understood watching him that he had heard from across the room, because he was a man who tracked the sound of a particular person's presence in any space, and knew from the quality of the sudden stillness in this corner that something had happened here that required his attention. "I believe," he said, and his voice carried to every person within 20 feet without any increase in its register, "that you were discussing Miss Alcott." The woman's chin lifted. "General Voss, we were simply..." "I heard what you were simply doing," he said. The same quiet, the same absolute evenness. Margaret had heard this quality once in the hospital, when a junior officer had spoken dismissively of an orderly in Voss's hearing, and Voss had responded in the same voice he used for everything else, and the officer had not made the same error again. I want to address it directly, because I find that indirect methods are insufficient for this kind of damage. The room was listening. Rooms always listened to Samuel Voss, and he knew it, and used it the way he used everything, precisely, without waste. "Miss Alcott," he said, "was a field nurse at Culpeper from September 1864 She worked 12-hour days in conditions that would have broken most people, with a standard of care that exceeded anything the army formally required of her. She did this not because she was required to, but because she understood it as necessary work, and she was a person who did necessary work well. He looked at the woman steadily. What you are implying about the nature of her care and about her reasons for being in Washington is false. Not ambiguous, not a matter of interpretation, false. The woman opened her mouth, closed it. Furthermore, he said, and his voice dropped slightly rather than rising, which was, Margaret had learned, the most precise indicator of how serious he was, not louder but more concentrated, more exact. You were implying that her present circumstances, her work, her residence, her presence in rooms like this one, are the product of calculation rather than honest labor. This is also false, and it reflects the particular laziness of people who explain a woman's competence by attaching it to a man's interest, because they find competence in its own right difficult to account for. The four women were very still. I would ask, he said, that you correct your account of this story when you repeat it, as I understand you will repeat it. The correction I am requesting is this. Miss Alcott's work was exceptional. Her presence in Washington is the result of her own decisions, and anyone who wishes to question either of those facts may direct their questions to me. He held the silence for exactly long enough. Then he turned and walked toward Margaret. 200 guests in the Hadley Spring Gala were attending, with the focused energy of people who understand they are witnessing something that will define the season's conversation to what General Samuel Voss did next. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her with the grey eyes, and what was in them was the same thing she had seen on that February Sunday when she had told him about her mother and the second hymn. The warmth that lived behind the serious surface, clear and present and making no effort to conceal itself. Are you all right? He said, just for her. Yes, she said. The same answer she had given him across a cot in Culpeper when he had asked after a difficult morning. I will be. You don't have to be yet, he said, but you will be. He said it with the certainty of a man who had made his way back from somewhere much further than this, and knew from experience that the way back was always available if you were willing to keep moving toward it. She looked at him. You heard from across the room. I was listening, he said, simply, as if it required no further explanation. It didn't. She had been listening for him in rooms for 14 months. The fact that he had been doing the same was not a surprise so much as a completion. There is a garden, she said. Off the south corridor, I saw it when we arrived. I know it, he said. Give me 2 minutes, I'll follow. The garden off the south corridor was bare in the way Washington gardens were bare in April. The promise of things visible in the soil, the air carrying the particular cold that was not winter anymore and not yet spring. The dark shapes of the bare trees holding their branches with the patience of things that had survived before and would survive again. Margaret stood at the garden's edge and gave herself 60 seconds. She was precise about the 60 seconds. She had learned that grief required a container, bounded, specific, or it spread. She let it spread for 60 seconds, and then she pulled it back and she was herself again. The practical woman from Pennsylvania who knew that the world applied different rules to women in her position and had made her peace with it and would continue to make her peace with it because the alternative was bitterness, and bitterness was a waste of time she did not have. She heard the door behind her. She did not turn immediately. She looked at the bare garden and the cold April sky and she breathed. Marsh told her, Voss said. His voice was quiet. I was told this evening before I found you. He has been constructing this story since the fall. I know, she said. I didn't know his name, but I knew someone was constructing it. She turned. He was standing at the door's edge, giving her the space she needed, which was what he always did. Present and patient and not pressing. It's the story that attaches itself to women like me in rooms like this one. I have watched it happen to other people. I was not surprised. You should not have to be unsurprised by it, he said. No, she agreed. But I am, and the work is still worth doing regardless. She looked at him. What will you do about Marsh? I have already done it, he said. I spoke with General Grant this evening, before the reception. Marsh's record of the past 14 months contains 3 significant operational failures that have not been formally examined. They will be examined now. He paused. I am not using them as leverage. They are real failures and they warranted examination regardless. But the timing is not coincidental. She looked at him. That's careful work. I have had time to plan it, he said, since October when I first became aware of what he was doing. Something in his face. I should have moved sooner. I wanted to be certain. I was being too careful. You were protecting me in the way you knew how, she said. I understand the impulse. I should also have spoken to you directly, he said, about what he was doing. I managed it without consulting you, which was not... He stopped. You are not someone who benefits from being managed rather than consulted. I know this. I did it anyway. I am sorry for it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had come back from 43 days of silence and returned to the world with the same precision and honesty he had presumably always possessed, and who was standing in an April garden in Washington, D.C., with his hat in both hands, apologizing for the specific variety of his protection rather than the fact of it. You should have told me, she said. Yes, he said immediately, no defense. I would have been, she paused, not grateful exactly, but I would have been a better partner in managing it if I had known. He looked at her. Something in his face changed, opened in the way she had watched it open over 17 mornings of Dickens and Pennsylvania light, and the hymn that changed depending on the weather of her interior. Partner, he said. She heard how she had used the word. She did not look away from it. Yes, she said, I think that is what I mean. He crossed the distance between them, 3 steps on the garden's flagstones, unhurried, the same measured pace as across a field hospital ward and across a ballroom floor, and stopped close enough that the conversation became private, in the way that conversations become private, when 2 people are close enough that the space between them carries meaning. I have been, he said, since September of last year, constructing the language you told me to construct. You said come back from it entirely, and I have been doing so, and the direction I have been coming back toward has been consistent. He looked at her with the grey eyes that were not frightening and never had been, that were simply very direct, very honest, very present. You are the direction. She stood in the cold April garden and let herself feel the full weight of it, not at a distance, not managed, but received the way she received real things, completely, with both hands. You didn't speak for 43 days, she said. No. The first word you said was my name. Yes. That should have told me something, she said, earlier than tonight. Something at the corner of his mouth moved, the full version, the one she had watched develop from the contained flicker of the hospital to the open warmth of the Sunday coffee house. It should have told me something earlier as well, he said. I was constructing the language. It takes time to build the right structure. She looked at him. She thought about Sunday mornings and Pennsylvania and Dickens and the second hymn for the difficult days. She thought about 43 days of a ceiling and a woman who did not stop talking to a man who could not answer, and what that meant about the shape of a person, and what it meant that the person had come back toward her when he came back. Samuel, she said, his given name. She had never used it before, always General Voss, the formal address, the correct distance. She watched his face when she said it, and it did what she had hoped it would do. It opened, fully, without reserve. Margaret, he said. Ask me, she said. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, preparing with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything. I am not a simple man, he said. I have carried the war longer than most, and I will carry parts of it always. I am not comfortable in rooms like the one we just left, and I do not expect to become comfortable in them. I am direct to a fault, and I have been told I am occasionally cold, which I think is a misreading of concentration, but I acknowledge the perception. He looked at her steadily. I am also, I believe, a man who is capable of genuine partnership with someone who tells me the truth, and who will tell the truth in return, and who does necessary work well and understands why that matters. A pause. I believe you are that person. I have believed it since a Wednesday morning in September of 1864, when you told me the dressing would pull and gave me fair warning first. She looked at him. Ask me, she said again gently. Marry me, he said. Not as a rescue, not as a repair, as a choice, yours and mine, made freely, with full knowledge of what we each are. He held her eyes. I would like to spend the remainder of my time in rooms that you are in. I would like to hear the hymn in the mornings and have fair warning before things pull. I would like to continue the conversation. All of it. A pause. If you are willing. She had been willing, she understood, since a September morning when she had looked at the grey eyes and thought, there you are. Yes, she said, I'm willing. He took her hand, both of his around hers, the same gesture she had watched him use when he remembered he had hands in the hospital, when the return was beginning and his body was remembering its own purposes. He held it carefully, the way he held things he had decided to keep. The cold April garden was quiet around them. Sunday, he said after a moment. Sunday, she agreed. He looked at her. Same time? 8 o'clock, she said. You're never late. I have been waking at 5 since 1862, he said. She laughed. A real one from the center, the kind she kept for real things. He looked at it the way he looked at things that surprised him with their value, which was to say with his full attention and something that was no longer the not-quite smile, but the complete version, open and warm and entirely unguarded. They went back inside. They did not make an announcement. Washington would understand from the quality of their return to the room together what had been decided in the garden, and Washington could do with that understanding whatever it chose. Margaret found Mrs. Halford near the fireplace, who looked at her and then passed her at Voss and raised both eyebrows. Margaret allowed a small smile. Mrs. Halford pressed her hand once, firmly, and said nothing, which was the most eloquent response available. Colonel Marsh left the reception early. No one remarked on it. They were married in June, in a judge's chambers in Washington, D.C., with 2 witnesses and no audience. Margaret wore her good dark dress, the same one she had worn to the Halford reception in January and to the Hadley Gala in April, and which had been present at every significant moment of the past 6 months. Voss noticed this and said nothing about it, which she understood as his version of noting it completely. The judge was brief and correct. The witnesses were Mrs. Halford and Voss's aide, a young lieutenant named Crane, who managed not to cry and succeeded only marginally. Afterward they had coffee, genuinely good coffee, because Voss had spent 3 days identifying the best coffee available in Washington, D.C., and had arranged for it to be present at this specific occasion, and they sat across from each other in the small room behind the judge's chambers and were, for approximately 20 minutes, simply themselves. Mrs. Voss, he said, testing the shape of it. That will take some adjustment, she said. For both of us, he agreed. He looked at her across the coffee. Are you? Yes, she said. The same answer she always gave him when he asked, complete and true and requiring no elaboration. He nodded. The precise gesture, he drank his coffee. She hummed 4 bars of the first hymn quietly, because her hands were occupied with the cup, and her hands needed the company of sound when they held things carefully. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. The first hymn, he said. Yes, she said. Good day, he said. Very good day, she said.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.